The character traits are different from character emotions or feelings. So emotions or feelings are something that a character or a person can feel at certain times, but they can change very quickly. For example, I might wake up feeling really grumpy, but then maybe I get some really good news and then I'm happy. So feelings can constantly be changing depending on what's happening in the story. So examples of feelings are a character might get scared or surprised or angry, upset, embarrassed, jealous, or excited. These would all answer the question of how does the character feel in that moment? Oh, I think that is my kale. All right, now that I got the kale out of the oven, let's talk about character traits. So, unlike emotions or feelings, character traits are the way that someone is most of the time. So, unlike a feeling like being happy that can quickly change depending on what's happening, if a character is kind, they're going to be kind most of the time. If a character is hardworking, they're going to be hardworking most of the time. Some other examples of character traits are being determined, outgoing. That means you really like to be social with other people and being active, being friendly, being brave. So, some ways that you can determine what a character's traits are is by thinking about the things that they do. So, for example, if we wanted to figure out if a character is brave, we would look at the things that they do, like are they standing up to someone who's scary or maybe a bully? Are they going into a situation that other people might be too scared to? If we were trying to think of someone who's confident, we would think about is this someone who, feels sure of themselves and doesn't let other people get them down. So in the story, you get a lot of information about what the characters do in different situations. And the author is usually not just going to straight out tell you the character is bossy, shy, or mean, but you can figure it out by looking at the things that they do. If a character in a story is being really mean to other people, even if the author doesn't have the sentence, this character is mean, you're probably going to be able to figure out that's one of their traits based on what they're doing. So we're going to practice this with Frog and Toad, figuring out what are some of the traits that Frog and Toad have. So we're going to use the book Days with Frog and Toad that we've been reading to think about Frog and Toad's character traits. So before we get into the book, I'm going to make a T-chart for Frog and Toad that you can make as well. So Frog, Toad. And this is what your reading activity for today is going to be. So you can go ahead and get started and do it along with me. So we had already read the book Tomorrow. So I'm not going to read it again. We're just going to remind ourselves what happened in the story and think about what it can tell us about Frog and Toad. So in Tomorrow, Toad wakes up and Frog is there, and Frog is noticing that Toad has got a really messy apartment. And so he keeps suggesting to him, it's a mess, maybe you should clean it up. But Toad keeps saying, I will do it tomorrow. So just this part can give me a few ideas about Frog and Toad's character traits. So even though it doesn't say it directly in the book, I'm going to infer. That word infer means use what's happening to figure something out, what character traits they have. So the fact that Toad doesn't want to do any of his work and is putting it off makes me think he's a little bit lazy. So I'm going to write lazy for Toad. And then Frog here, as we keep reading, he keeps trying to get Toad to do his work. So he's telling him all these things that are messy. So he, I think, is trying to be a good friend. So I would maybe say, friendly for Frog. I also feel like he's kind of responsible, especially compared to Toad, who's being really lazy. I would use the word responsible. Going to sound it out while I'm spelling. And then since I feel like Toad is kind of the opposite, now for Toad I could write irresponsible. So is a prefix you can add to mean like not, so not responsible. So on our chart so far, we have that Frog is friendly and responsible, and we have that Toad is lazy and irresponsible. And the way that we got those is that we looked at how the characters were behaving in the story and we inferred what that can tell us about them as characters or what their character traits are. You're going to continue this chart as we read another Frog and Toad story. But as we're reading, I want you to make sure that when you're coming up with inferences about the characters, that you can back it up or support it with evidence from the story. We can't just make things up. So we can't just say, oh, I think Frog is really mean. But if you don't have any evidence for him doing something mean, you have no reason to say that. So any inference you make, you need to be able to have evidence for it. So there might be things that we disagree on. Like last year, I remember we did the same activity with the story Tomorrow. And there were some students who were like, I think Frog is actually being kind of bossy by telling Toad to clean his home. And they backed that up by saying there's evidence in the story with him telling Toad over and over again what's messy and that he should clean it. So as long as you can back up your inference, you might get something different than someone else. One person might say that Frog is friendly, while someone else might say he's more bossy. And that's okay, as long as you back up your inference with evidence from the story. The story you're going to be using for your activity to finish the chart that we started about Frog and Toad is called A Lost Button. Toad and Frog went for a long walk. They walked across a large meadow. They walked in the woods. They walked along the river. At last, they went back home to Toad's house. "Oh, drat," said Toad. "Not only do my feet hurt, but I have lost one of the buttons on my jacket." "Don't worry," said Frog. "We will go back to all the places where we walked. We will soon find your button." They walked back to the large meadow. They began to look for the button in the tall grass. "Here is your button," cried Frog. "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button is black. My button was white." Toad put the black button in his pocket. A sparrow flew down. "Excuse me," said the sparrow. "Did you lose a button? I found one." "That is not my button," said Toad. "That button has 2 holes. My button had 4 holes." Toad put the button with 2 holes in his pocket. They went back to the woods and looked on the dark paths. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," cried Toad. "That button is small. My button was big." Toad put the small button in his pocket. A raccoon came out from behind a tree. I heard that you were looking for a button," he said. "Here's one that I just found." "That is not my button," wailed Toad. "That button is square. My button was round." Toad put the square button in his pocket. Frog and Toad went back to the river. They looked for the button in the mud. "Here's your button," said Frog. "That is not my button," shouted Toad. "That button is thin. My button was thick." Toad put the thin button in his pocket. He was very angry. He jumped up and down and screamed, "The whole world is covered with buttons, and not one of them is mine." Toad ran home and slammed the door. There, on the floor, he saw his white 4-holed, big, round, thick button. "Oh," said Toad, "it was here all the time. What a lot of trouble I have made for Frog." Toad took all of the buttons out of his pocket. He took his sewing box down from the shelf. Toad sewed the buttons all over his jacket. The next day, Toad gave his jacket to Frog. Frog thought that it was beautiful. He put it on and jumped for joy. None of the buttons fell off. Toad had sewed them on very well. So using the story that we just read, go ahead and pause the video and finish the chart about Frog and Toad's character traits. And if you really want to go extra, you can even give evidence for each of the character traits to let me know how you made that inference.